The mountain doesn't care about your training. It doesn't care about your airborne wings, or your M16, or the fact that you've jumped out of perfectly good aircraft over Fort Campbell 100 times. In the highlands of Thua Thien province, 4,000 feet above sea level, with the A Shau Valley breathing below you like something alive and hungry, the mountain has one agenda: to take everything from you before you understand what's happening. Firebase Ripcord sits on that mountain, and in the summer of 1970, 3 regiments of North Vietnamese Army regulars agreed with the mountain completely. Sergeant Danny Kowalski, 22 years old, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, second tour, the kind of quiet that meant something, had been on Ripcord for 6 weeks when the first real assaults began. Beside him, Specialist Marcus Webb, 20, Memphis, Tennessee, fast with a radio, and faster with a dark joke. Private First Class Tommy Delgado, 19, San Antonio, the youngest, who still wrote home every single day without fail. 3 men who'd learned to sleep through incoming and stay awake through silence, because silence on that mountain was the thing that actually scared you. On the morning of July 5th, 1970, the silence ended. There was a smell in the air that morning that none of them could identify. Not cordite, not the familiar rot of jungle and red clay. Something older, something that made the dog tags feel heavier against your sternum. Kowalski noticed it. He didn't say anything. He would understand what it meant 48 hours later, and he would never stop understanding it. If you're watching this, you already know that military history isn't just about terrain and tactics. It's about the men who stood on that terrain when everything the enemy possessed was aimed directly at them. The 101st Airborne story at Firebase Ripcord is one of the most intense and least told sieges of the Vietnam War. This channel exists to honor stories like this one with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war and without simplifying the impossible choices these men faced. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade from memory.
Danny Kowalski grew up in the shadow of Pittsburgh's steel mills, the son of a Korean War veteran who came home and never once talked about what he'd seen. That silence taught Kowalski more than most men learn from words. He enlisted at 18, not out of patriotism alone, but because in 1967 there weren't many options on Pittsburgh's south side for a kid with a diploma and no money for college. He'd done one tour, come home, spent 6 months unable to explain to anyone what was wrong with him, and re-enlisted. Not because he wanted to go back, because he didn't know how to be anywhere else. By his second tour, he'd developed the particular economy of movement that long-service soldiers acquire. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, every action deliberate. He kept a photograph in the chest pocket of his flak jacket, his younger sister Marie, standing in front of their parents' row house in her high school graduation dress, squinting into the Pittsburgh afternoon sun. He'd carried it since the first week of his first tour. The crease down the middle had gone white. Marcus Webb had enlisted because his older brother had served, and Marcus wasn't going to be the one who didn't. Memphis had given him fast hands, a fast tongue, and an easy confidence that made frightened men feel steadier without knowing why. As Kowalski's radio operator for 4 months, he had become as essential as water. Delgado was something different. 19 and still soft around the edges, he wrote home every single day. Not because he expected a daily reply, but because the act of writing kept him tethered to the idea that there was a world beyond the wire. He'd been on Ripcord for 31 days. He was still learning to read the sounds. Together the three had settled into the wordless rhythm that forms only between men who've depended on each other under fire. They knew each other's breathing patterns, each other's tells before contact, each other's specific silences. What they'd built could not be written in any letter home. Ripcord itself was a scar on a ridgeline, a cleared hilltop with bunkers, howitzer pits, concertina wire, and the constant smell of diesel and red laterite dust. It had been carved out of the jungle just months earlier. The mountain had already begun taking it back. Firebase Ripcord was not improvised. In the spring of 1970, with President Nixon's Vietnamization policy accelerating American troop withdrawals, the 101st Airborne Division's 3rd Brigade pushed west into the mountains of Thua Thien Province with a specific mission: establish a network of artillery fire bases capable of threatening the North Vietnamese Army's primary supply corridor through the A Shau Valley. The A Shau was the enemy's highway. Running north to south along the Laotian border, it funneled weapons, ammunition, and entire regiments from the Ho Chi Minh Trail directly into the populated coastal lowlands. American commanders had fought over that valley before. The most recent major engagement, Doi Ap Bia, Hamburger Hill, was only 14 months in the past. Each time the Americans seized terrain in the A Shau, they eventually had to leave it. The valley, like the mountain, operated on a longer timescale than any American operation. Ripcord changed the equation, at least in theory. Positioned on a ridgeline just northeast of the valley's northern entrance, its howitzers could reach directly into the supply corridor. For that reason alone, it had to be destroyed. The 324th B PAVN Division had occupied the A Shau for months, preparing its positions. By early July, 3 NVA regiments had been quietly massing in the surrounding hills. Not probing, not harassing, massing. Colonel Benjamin Harrison, commanding the 3rd Brigade, understood that Ripcord's survival required controlling the high ground around it. On July 7th, he sent a company of Kowalski's battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, west toward Hill 1000, a ridgeline that overlooked the base and sheltered enemy mortar positions. They tried for 2 days. Artillery, air support, everything available. They could not take it. On July 14th, they tried again with more than 2 companies. Same result. The North Vietnamese on that hill were, in Harrison's own words, too strong, too determined, too well fortified to be dislodged without the cost in American lives becoming too great. By July 14th, after the second failed assault, Kowalski had stopped trying to count the incoming rounds each night. There were too many. What he counted instead were his men at morning stand-to, the quiet confirmation that everyone who'd gone to sleep had also woken up. Kowalski had made a single promise before the battalion left Fort Campbell, not to his family, not in any letter, but silently to himself, standing in front of his men their last night stateside. He was going to bring every one of them home. It was the kind of promise you make when you don't yet know what the next 90 days will cost you. Stories like the ones these men carried don't survive in official after-action reports. They survive because people who were there, or who knew someone who was, choose to keep them alive. If you served in Vietnam, if you knew someone at Ripcord, if you served with the 101st Airborne anywhere in that war, the comment section below isn't just a place to type. It's where these memories live on. Add what you know. Add what you remember. These stories belong to all of you. The soldiers of the 324th B PAVN Division did not arrive in the A Shau Valley by accident or desperation. They had been fighting in this region, on and off, since before most of Kowalski's squad had started high school. They understood the monsoon cycles, the drainage patterns of every creek, the approach routes that American helicopters couldn't see from altitude. They had studied the Firebase network the 101st was building across the mountain ridges of Thien, and they understood it as a genuine threat, because it was. The howitzers on those ridgelines could reach the supply lines that sustained everything they were doing in Military Region 1. The NVA commanders directing operations in this region had also studied the American pattern very closely. Seize terrain, establish fire bases, take casualties, withdraw under political pressure. It had happened at Hamburger Hill. It had happened at Khe Sanh. It had happened in the A Shau itself, in previous years, repeatedly. The Firebase network was a problem, but it was a problem that could be solved without a single decisive assault that invited American air power to destroy attacking formations in the open. The solution was methodical: indirect fire, supply interdiction, targeted attacks on the outwork positions the base depended on, and patience. Time, the political officers argued openly, favored them absolutely. 3 regiments was an enormous commitment. These were not guerrillas. They were seasoned soldiers, many veterans of multiple campaigns, armed with 82mm and 120mm mortars, heavy machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. They had spent 2 months fortifying their positions in the surrounding hills, stockpiling ammunition, and studying Ripcord's layout from every angle. They had forward observers with field glasses calculating impact adjustments after every fire mission. The mortar fire walking toward Ripcord's howitzer pits each night was not random. It was iterative, patient, and systematically precise. They also had families, letters, villages in North Vietnam they had left behind. A belief, real and genuinely held, that they were fighting to reunify their country against a foreign military presence that had no legitimate claim to be there. The young soldiers in those ridgeline bunkers were terrified the same way Delgado was terrified. Different uniform, different language, identical fear. They looked at the sky before dawn and wondered if they would see another one. That is an uncomfortable fact. It is also simply true. For the 101st Airborne Division, Firebase Ripcord represented something beyond a tactical position. The political context of the summer of 1970 made every fire base in Vietnam a proxy argument about whether Vietnamization was working. If American fire support bases could project into the A Shau and keep the NVA bottled up in the mountains during the drawdown, Nixon's strategy was viable. If the NVA could break the network and threaten the coast while American troops were still in country, the entire premise of the withdrawal collapsed publicly and catastrophically. What that meant for Kowalski and his men was that they were defending a policy as much as a ridgeline. And policies, unlike ridgelines, can be abandoned without the men who defended them being consulted. Colonel Harrison understood this. His mission was to hold the Firebase network, control the surrounding high ground, and protect his men's lives in an environment where every casualty now generated command-level scrutiny. General Abrams had already asked why so many Americans were dying at a single firebase. General Berry, the acting division commander, questioned Harrison's tactical approach on the Hill 1,000 assaults, believing he had not fully employed available firepower, but stepped back from his initial inclination to relieve him. The command pressure moving down the chain was explicit and documented. Achieve the mission, limit the headline count. Those 2 requirements were no longer compatible. The 6 105mm howitzers on Ripcord's ridgeline were everything. They were the reason the firebase existed. Without them, it was just a hilltop with wire. Every NVA mortar crew on the surrounding ridgelines understood that. So, did every man inside the wire who walked past the howitzer pits each day and counted the rounds in the ammunition dump. The question living in the space between incoming rounds, the one no one asked aloud, was whether the base could absorb what was coming. 3 regiments, the high ground in enemy hands, the ammunition supply shrinking. Ripcord had been built to threaten the enemy's corridor. Whether it could survive long enough to do so was what July would answer. If you're still watching, you already understand what most people miss. That military history isn't about glorifying war. It's about honoring the men who fought with courage and skill while being honest about the decisions that placed them there. Subscribe now and join this community. And if you believe the men of Firebase Ripcord deserve to be remembered properly, hit the like button. It tells YouTube these stories belong in the conversation. Because they do. The first sense that told you something had changed was touch. Not sight, not sound, touch. The ground shook before you heard anything. A low percussion that started in your boots and climbed your spine before your brain had time to categorize it as incoming. On Ripcord in July of 1970, that shudder became the constant baseline of existence. You ate with it, you slept with it, or tried to. You learned to distinguish by frequency of vibration alone whether the round that had just impacted was an 82mm or something heavier. When the NVA began employing 120mm mortars on July 18th, they carried a signature all their own, a base register that you felt in your molars before you heard it in your ears. Then came the sound itself. The concussion traveled faster than the shrapnel, and in the fractions of a second between the initial crack and the spray of fragmentation, the body made decisions before the mind caught up. Kowalski had been in enough contact to know this, knowing it didn't make it easier to process. Webb had developed a specific tic. He'd close his eyes for exactly 1 second after each impact, then open them and key the radio. Delgado didn't close his eyes at all. He stared hard at whatever was directly in front of him, as though he could anchor himself to the physical world through visual intensity alone. Small adaptations, specific to each man. The siege built them. The smell of Ripcord in the second week of July was a particular compound. Diesel exhaust from the generators, the iron and earth smell of freshly turned laterite clay where rounds had hit, the chemical backwash of propellant cooking in the summer heat. Underneath everything, the jungle breathed. The A Shau Valley below exhaled moisture even in July, and the mist collected on the wire each morning with complete indifference to what was happening on the ridgeline above it. On the morning of July 19th, a CH-47 Chinook came in low on the eastern approach, loaded with 105mm ammunition for the howitzer pits. The base needed it badly. 6 days of sustained bombardment had burned through reserves that no one had anticipated depleting this fast. The crew knew the approach was observed. Every approach to Ripcord was observed by that point. The NVA had plotted the landing zone, and they were ready. The aircraft took fire on its final approach. It did not recover. What came next lodged itself permanently in the memory of everyone who saw it. The Chinook came down hard onto the ammunition supply point. Not a controlled landing, a crash, and the world caught fire. Kowalski was 40 meters away when the first secondary explosion tore through the dump. The smell arrived before the shockwave, aviation fuel, thick and chemical, and then the sharper smell of propellant cooking off as 105mm rounds cooked in the burning wreckage. Then the shockwave hit, and he was on the ground without remembering falling. The taste was dust and blood from a split lip, and underneath both something metallic he recognized as the specific flavor of his own adrenaline. He could not hear properly for 30 seconds. In that silence, he understood what it meant that Ripcord had just lost its guns. 6 howitzers destroyed. The artillery that gave the firebase its entire strategic reason for existing. 6 guns gone in less time than it takes to read a sentence aloud. On the ridgelines above, NVA forward observer teams watched the smoke column rise. They held their mortar fire for 20 minutes after the Chinook went down. Whether this was calculation, confusion, or something that might cautiously be called restraint is impossible to know with certainty. What is known is that the paratroopers inside the wire used those 20 minutes to pull injured men from the burning ammunition point, assess which positions remained functional, and establish a perimeter against the assault that everyone understood was being prepared. Every man moving through that smoke knew the arithmetic had changed. The base that had been sent to threaten the A Shau Valley no longer had the weapons to do it. What it had now was walls, wire, and the men determined to hold both. On Hill 1000, the NVA companies that had repelled 2 American assaults over the previous 2 weeks had also paid a price. Airstrikes and preparatory artillery had preceded each American attempt to climb the ridgeline, and the bunkers carved into the rock and red clay had absorbed hits that would have destroyed improvised positions. The men inside those bunkers were exhausted, living on rice and whatever resupply their own logistics could push forward along trails that American aircraft worked constantly to find and cut. They were not invincible. They were determined, and they were following orders, and some of them would follow those orders until there were no more of them left to follow anything. Colonel Harrison, orbiting in his command helicopter through the smoke over the ammunition point on July 19th, made his assessment. The primary weapon system was destroyed. The high ground was in enemy hands. 3 regiments were positioned for a major assault. The political pressure from above was explicit, and the intelligence was becoming clear. The North Vietnamese were preparing to storm the base. The question was whether the timing of that assault would allow a garrison evacuation before it came. What none of them knew, not Harrison, not Berry, not the men holding the berm, was how the NVA command would respond when the evacuation order came. Whether they would press their assault in the hours before the helicopters arrived, catching the garrison at its most vulnerable, or whether they would wait for a cleaner operational situation. That uncertainty lived inside every man who would spend the night of July 22nd inside the wire. That smell from the morning of July 5th, the one Kowalski had noticed and couldn't name. He understood it now. He'd encountered it once before, in a different valley, a different year. It was the smell of a position being surrounded by men who had decided to wait rather than advance or retreat. Patient men. Men who had calculated that time was on their side. The NVA had been patient since before the first assaults. The smell was patience itself, and it had been there from the beginning. But the evacuation had not yet come, and the night of July 22nd still had hours in it. The evacuation order arrived on July 22nd, and it carried its own particular weight. For a garrison that had spent 19 days absorbing everything 3 NVA regiments could deliver at a mountain, the word evacuate was not defeat, not primarily. It arrived first as relief. The specific, complicated relief of being told that survival was still the plan, that the helicopters were coming, that the arithmetic had been rerun at the division level, and the answer had changed. Kowalski heard it through Webb's radio handset and felt something unclench in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. There was dark humor in it, the way there is always dark humor in military situations that have passed the point where ordinary humor functions. Webb said something about how he'd been meaning to request a room transfer anyway. Delgado laughed. The particular sharp laugh that means a person is not entirely sure they're allowed to feel what they're feeling. On the berm, men exchanged glances that contained everything that couldn't be said out loud. Kowalski opened the chest pocket of his flak jacket for the first time in 5 days and looked at Marie's photograph. High school graduation dress, Pittsburgh sun, the crease down the middle that had gone white years ago. She had no idea where he was or what the last 19 days had been. He would call her when he got somewhere with a phone. He would tell her everything was fine. She would know he was lying and would be grateful for the lie. He put the photograph back. The helicopters were coming on July 23rd, with Air Force fighters and Army gunships running cover. All they had to do was hold the perimeter until the last man lifted off. In Washington, officials watching the casualty numbers from Ripcord had reached a level of alarm that bordered on panic. Every dead American was ammunition for the anti-war movement, and by the summer of 1970, that movement was not abstract. It was congressional hearings, it was editorial pages, it was the specific political vulnerability of an administration managing a war it had promised to end. General Abrams had already questioned why so many men were dying on a single firebase. The pressure flowing down through the chain of command was documented and explicit. Get the garrison out without adding to the headline number. Executing an evacuation under enemy observation is one of the most tactically difficult operations a unit can perform. You are doing two contradictory things simultaneously: reducing your combat power by loading men onto helicopters and maintaining enough combat power to hold the perimeter until the last helicopter departs. Every man who boards a helicopter makes the remaining men more exposed. Every minute the evacuation takes is a minute the NVA has to observe the pattern, adjust fires, and choose its moment to attack. The NVA had been watching every helicopter approach to Ripcord for 3 weeks. They knew the flight paths, the landing zones, the exact window of maximum vulnerability when a helicopter is committed to its approach and cannot maneuver. For Colonel Harrison, the question was whether the evacuation could be executed before the final assault materialized. The intelligence indicated the assault was imminent. Whether imminent meant hours or days was the variable that no intelligence source could pin down. What would you do with that knowledge? Not in a leadership seminar, not with time to think. On a firebase that has been under siege for 19 days, with the evacuation inbound and the perimeter thinning and the surrounding hills full of men who have been patient long enough. You hold. You send the order down through the squad leaders, and they send it down to the riflemen, and every man on that berm understands the same arithmetic. The helicopters don't fly if the perimeter breaks. The men who've already loaded don't make it home if the position collapses before the last lift. So you hold. You trust the man on your left and the man on your right. And you don't think about the promise you made in a gymnasium at Fort Campbell, because thinking about it does nothing useful in this moment. You hold what you can. That had become the entire mission. Not close the A Shau corridor, not project fire into the enemy's supply lines, not prove that Vietnamization worked. Hold what you can, for as long as you can hold it, so that the men who need to leave can leave. Kowalski held. His squad held. The perimeter held through the evacuation on July 23rd, through the air cover and the incoming and the thunder of helicopters coming in low and fast and lifting and returning. Harrison's assessment proved right. The NVA did not launch their final assault during the extraction itself. Perhaps they miscalculated the speed of the lift. Perhaps they chose to wait for a cleaner tactical situation. Whatever the reason, the garrison came off Ripcord. The men who could be moved were moved. The promise Kowalski had made at Fort Campbell, bring everyone home, had fractured long before July 23rd. 112 Americans died in the Ripcord area of operations. Some of them were from Kowalski's battalion. One of them had borrowed Delgado's pencil 2 days before he died and never returned it. The promise was the kind that cannot be kept in a war that doesn't offer the option. Kowalski understood that now. He would not stop understanding it. The helicopters carried them away from the mountain. The mountain remained. For 8 days after the garrison lifted off Ripcord on July 23rd, the United States military did what it could always do better than any other force on Earth. Project overwhelming firepower from distance. 12,300 rounds of artillery, more than 10,000 pounds of bombs. The surrounding hills, the hills that 3 NVA regiments had spent months fortifying, the ridge lines that had sheltered the mortar crews and the assault battalions, and the observer positions that had made the defense so costly, absorbed everything the Air Force and Army could deliver in concentrated, sustained application. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. There was no close combat, no perimeter to hold, no men bleeding on a landing zone. It was pure destructive force applied against positions that no longer needed to be defended in person. Kowalski, evacuated with the rest of his company, was behind the lines when the bombardment began. He heard it. Everyone within 20 kilometers heard it. The estimated NVA dead from the post-evacuation fires around Ripcord was 400. That figure represents the accounting that could be observed and documented. The actual cost the NVA paid across the full operational period was higher. Entire pre-positioned assault units, mortar sections, forward observer teams that the fires caught in their prepared positions on the ridgelines. It was the kind of firepower that resolved the tactical problem after the tactical problem had already resolved the strategic question. Ripcord was gone. The A Shau corridor remained open. The primary objective had not been achieved. What the 12,300-round bombardment represented was not reversal of that outcome. It was price. The specific, documented, verifiable price that the 101st Airborne Division had the authority and the assets to impose from standoff distance. The price paid at range, because paying it in close combat had become operationally unsustainable. What the 3rd Brigade had demonstrated at Ripcord, and what the post-evacuation fires confirmed, was not the capacity to hold a mountain against 3 regiments. They hadn't held it, and the outcome was arithmetically clear. The firebase destroyed, the corridor open, 112 men dead. What they had demonstrated was something different, something that resists clean entry into after-action reports. The capacity to absorb a tactical defeat while maintaining unit cohesion, extract a garrison under fire, and impose significant cost on the enemy through every available means before and after the withdrawal. It wasn't about firepower. It never entirely was. The paratroopers of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, standing on Ripcord's berm positions through 19 days of siege, had something that airstrikes and artillery rounds can supplement but cannot create. The particular refusal that defines soldiers who have decided not to be broken regardless of what the tactical situation says is reasonable. Kowalski had not held Ripcord. No one had. But he had held his piece of it for exactly as long as holding his piece of it was the mission. That distinction between strategic failure and individual commitment was the most important distinction he would carry for the rest of his life. The 3rd Brigade had also achieved, without knowing it, one of Ripcord's secondary effects. For the months that the Firebase network had operated in the mountains of Thua Thien, the 324th PAVN Division and the 3 regiments it committed to the siege were dealing with Ripcord. They were not moving toward the coastal lowlands. They were in the mountains, absorbing American airstrikes and expending ammunition at a rate their supply chain felt. Whether that delay justified the cost is the question that the soldiers themselves could not answer, and that their commanders would spend years attempting to. The NVA units that had besieged Ripcord almost immediately redirected against Firebase O'Reilly to the north, which had relied on Ripcord's guns for artillery support and was now exposed. They were professional soldiers who had achieved their primary objective and were pressing their operational advantage on schedule. The same patient, methodical pressure now aimed at the next problem. The South Vietnamese 1st Infantry, defending O'Reilly with American air and artillery support from fire bases farther east, held through August. The NVA suspended the siege on August 20th, likely calculating that continued operations under sustained American air attack exceeded the operational gain. They withdrew to the mountains as the rainy season approached. The question alive since the strategic setup, whether Ripcord could prevent the NVA from moving freely through the A Shau toward the coast, had its answer. It could not permanently, not under the political constraints that had governed every decision from Washington down to the wire. The corridor remained open. The Firebase network retracted to the eastern Piedmont as the wet season arrived. What the 3rd Brigade had achieved was delay, friction, and cost imposed on an enemy that was eventually going to have its way with the strategic situation regardless. Whether delay was worth 112 American lives is the kind of question that takes decades to answer. The soldiers could not answer it. Their commanders answered it in the moment, the only way the moment allowed, and the men on the ground paid the bill. Victory came in the form of smoke columns over empty ridgelines and a body count that history recorded as estimated. But the true accounting of Ripcord would take years to complete. Most of it would not be paid on that mountain. Most of it would be paid in the lives the men carried home. 112 Americans died in the area of operations around Firebase Ripcord. That number deserves to be held for a moment before anything else is said. Each of those men had a name. Most were young, 18, 19, 20. The ages when a person is still becoming who they will be, still carrying the soft uncertainty of a future that hasn't resolved itself yet. Many came from places like Kowalski's Pittsburgh, mill towns, small cities, rural counties where military service was both tradition and the option that remained when other options weren't available. They had mothers who would spend the rest of their lives marking the anniversary. Fathers who would never fully close the door on the room their son had left. Siblings who would grow up with a particular shape of absence in the family, specific and permanent. 698 were wounded. Those are the men the number doesn't capture adequately. The ones who came home missing pieces, physical and otherwise, who negotiated with the VA for decades over injuries the after-action reports had no category for. The men who developed the particular relationship with sleep and sudden sound that Vietnam veterans knew by experience long before the medical literature gave it a name. On the NVA side, the estimated 400 dead around Ripcord itself represent only the portion of the cost that could be observed. The actual figure across the full campaign was higher. Those men also had names. They had families in villages across North Vietnam who received notifications that arrived months late, if they arrived at all. The grief on the other side of a battle is not diminished by the fact that the battle was fought against you. It is simply the same grief carried in a different language. Kowalski knew none of these numbers on July 23rd. He knew the names of the men from his company who hadn't boarded the helicopters. He knew those names the way you know a phone number you've dialed so many times it lives in your fingers rather than your memory. The firebase itself was left to the mountain. Whatever the post-evacuation fires hadn't destroyed, the jungle would reclaim. The sandbags would rot. The wire would rust. The howitzer pits that had held 6 guns and then none would fill slowly with water and vine. The mountain doesn't care about your firebase any more than it cared about your training. Kowalski's company moved to a rear area to refit and reconstitute. Quiet, by the standards of what they'd come through, was not entirely quiet. The body doesn't unlearn 19 days of siege in a week. You flinch at helicopters. You wake at sounds that aren't sounds. You find yourself counting the men around you at intervals that would seem strange in any other context. What the Army gave them in that refit area was routine. Formations, equipment checks, weapons maintenance, physical training. Routine is not nothing. For men who have been inside sustained chaos, routine is a kind of medicine. It doesn't close the wound. It keeps you moving while the wound decides what it's going to be. Delgado had stopped writing his daily letter for 3 days after the evacuation. When he started again, Kowalski noticed the letters were shorter. He didn't ask about it. Webb had gone very quiet, not the quiet between his jokes, but a different quality of silence that Kowalski recognized and didn't push. The radio that Webb had kept alive through 19 days of siege sat in the corner of the refit area, and Webb didn't touch it during off hours. This was notable. It was also entirely understandable. Kowalski opened the chest pocket of his flak jacket and looked at the photograph again. Marie in her graduation dress, Pittsburgh sun. The crease down the middle, unchanged. The photograph had come through everything intact. He'd kept it protected, reflexively, through every contact, every incoming round, every moment he'd been on the ground without remembering falling. It looked exactly as it had before Ripcord. He put it back into the pocket. He didn't know yet what it meant that it was unchanged when so much else was not. He would figure that out in the years of later that were waiting for him. What Ripcord had done to Kowalski was not visible from the outside in any way a medical officer would note. He performed his duties. He ate. He slept. Not well, but he slept. What had changed was underneath. The idea he'd carried, that a sergeant could, through competence and will, protect the men around him from the worst possibilities, had run directly into the arithmetic of the siege. 112 was the arithmetic. Some of those men had sergeants as competent and as determined as Kowalski. It hadn't been enough. The mountain had not consulted anyone's competence rating before it made its demands. Hold what you can. He had understood those words in a firebase in the highlands of Thien in the summer of 1970, and the understanding was permanent. Not what you hoped to hold, not what the operational order required, what you actually could. For 19 days, that had been his entire moral universe reduced to its functional minimum. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became decades, and the weight of it never quite got lighter. Danny Kowalski came home from Vietnam in the spring of 1971. Pittsburgh, the row house. His father, who had come back from Korea and never once talked about it, looked at him across the kitchen table for a long moment, then went back to his coffee without saying anything. His father understood. That was the best version of coming home that most of them got. The years that followed were not simple years. Post-traumatic stress didn't have its clinical name yet in 1971, but it had all of its symptoms, familiar and specific. The flinching at helicopters, the counting of men in rooms, the dreams that arrived with topographical precision, the ridgeline, the berm, the particular angle of the A Shau Valley visible from Ripcord's eastern perimeter before the smoke obscured it. The way incoming rounds have a half-life of years inside a man's nervous system, diminishing but never fully clearing. The touch of certain ground vibrations that bring the molars back, briefly, to July. He worked, he married, he had children. He built the ordinary structure of a life around the weight he'd brought back from Thua, Thien province. Some men in his position broke under that weight in ways that couldn't be rebuilt. Some found ways to set it down, periodically, in VA waiting rooms and veterans groups, and the particular company of men who knew what the weight felt like without needing it explained. Kowalski was somewhere in between, functional, reliable, carrying it. He didn't talk about Ripcord for years. Then, in the early 1980s, he began to, not at length, not with strangers, but in pieces, to his children, to his wife, to a veterans group in a Catholic church basement 3 blocks from the row house where he'd grown up. He talked about Webb, who'd made it home, about Delgado, whose letters had gotten shorter and then, eventually, longer again. About a fire base on a mountain in Vietnam that the mountain had reclaimed before anyone had time to argue about whether the whole thing had been worth it. He served honorably. Every man in that garrison served honorably. The paratroopers who climbed Hill 1000 twice and were stopped twice served honorably. The helicopter crews who flew approach after approach into a landing zone that was being directly observed and targeted, they served honorably. The medics who moved across open ground under sustained bombardment to reach wounded men served honorably. The radio operators who kept the nets alive through 19 days of siege served honorably. The men on the other side of that wire also served their country as they understood their obligation to serve it. The NVA soldiers in the ridgeline bunkers, the mortar crews, the forward observers, they were professional soldiers who were brave, who suffered losses of their own, whose families waited for them the same way American families waited. They deserved the same acknowledgement. The courage of the paratroopers on Ripcord's berm and the courage of the men in those surrounding hills are not in competition. Both can be true simultaneously. War doesn't require us to choose one over the other. It only asks us to recognize that the cost is always paid by the people who go. The fault, where there was fault, lay in a strategy that placed 112 men in a position that the military and political leadership already understood could not be held at acceptable cost under the constraints they were simultaneously imposing. The soldiers were sent to close the A Shau corridor. The political climate forbade the casualties that closing it would require. Those two requirements cannot coexist. The men on the perimeter paid the price of that contradiction. That is not a failure of the soldiers. It is a failure of the decisions that sent them there. That failure belongs to the level at which decisions are made, not the level at which they are executed. The photograph of Marie survived 2 full tours and came home with Kowalski to Pittsburgh. The crease down the middle went white a long time ago. He told his son about it once, about carrying it through 19 days of siege on a ridgeline in Vietnam, about opening it during the evacuation and finding it unchanged. His son asked why that mattered. Kowalski said he wasn't entirely sure, maybe because some things survive everything you put them through. Not many, not enough, but some. Hold what you can. He'd understood those words on a mountain in the summer of 1970. He carried that understanding the same way he'd carried the photograph, protected, folded, always within reach. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. The men who held Firebase Ripcord gave everything they had to a position they were ultimately ordered to leave. That is not a failure of the men. It is a failure of the strategy that sent them there without the authorization to do what the mission required. Honor them for what they did. Question the decisions that made them do it. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe it matters. Honor the warriors. Question the wars.